So it turns out that Mendeln Ring on minions is going to be an incredibly powerful build this season. And now that I've spent some time working through different things, trying out different aspects, testing out all the various mechanics, if you haven't seen my most recent video talking about Mendeln mechanics, I would highly recommend watching it. I'll go ahead and link it above. You don't want to miss out on that because that context is going to be important. But let's go ahead and talk about the Minion Necromancer. I'll have a build planner down below like I always do. I'll also use timestamps in case you just want to jump around to the parts that you need to see. I can show you this with Mythics. I can show you it with alternatives to Mythics. And basically, I think we have a really good idea of what the build's going to look like and some minor tweaks, some minor optimizations moving forward. But let's go ahead and get into it. So right now you're watching me running a pit 70. We cleared it with, I don't know, like 4 or 5 minutes left on the clock. And the build feels really good here. And the funny part about it is that once you see my gear, my Paragon, in fact, if you were a sharp-eyed individual, you might even notice I only have 4 Paragon glyphs currently in my board. I'm only Paragon level 162. And on top of that, I don't even have a rank 46 glyph yet. And I just realized while looking back at the editing, I have a rank 1 glyph in my Paragon as well. I have an ancestral weapon, and then other than the 2 purple pieces of gear that I'm wearing, basically nothing else going for me. So there is an insanely high ceiling for where this build has left to go. But what is the huge differentiator between last season and this season? What happened after the downfall of the Holy Bolts Elixir and when minions were basically re-relegated down to C tier at best? Well, they changed how Mendeln Ring works with your minions. Or, should I say, they made it so that the ring works with your minions at all. Cool part about the build right now is that, one, it's continuing to use a golem, and while in the hyper endgame, the hyper, like, max pit tier pushing version of this build, it probably won't be using a golem. The utility and benefit of having it on your skill bar right now cannot be overstated. And on top of that, there's actually going to be a fairly good speed farming version of this build, playing on 1 torment level lower, doing outdoor content, doing the Undercity, etc. We actually get to use the golem, and the new golem aspect, Fell Gluttony, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But I just kind of want to point out right here during this boss kill section, just how tanky and resilient we are on, again, tier 70. So this means that we're already up into world tier 4. This is 5 levels past what you would need to be able to clear just to be able to go play in world tier 4. And every single level of the pit, once you get up to this point, is a huge jump in both damage taken and damage needed to be able to clear it. But by the end of this, the boss is dead. We basically didn't have to do anything other than dodge the Lilith attacks of all things. And even that, we kind of just skirted around and then slightly moved outside of the range. But let's go ahead and talk about the build. Again, timestamps down below, build planner down below. You're not going to want to miss out on those things. Kind of use them to follow along, but you're going to want to listen to the video itself because we're going to talk about a lot of different mechanics and things that the build planner just won't be able to communicate to you. I'm going to go ahead and start off with the gear, because I actually think that the gear itself is probably the most nuanced and important part of this build. And I'll very quickly go over everything else, but again, there's going to be a build planner, so I don't want to waste too much of your time. But let's go ahead and talk about that gear and the alternatives to the Mythics that I'm wearing right now, because even they themselves are not optimal for this build. Hey, how you doing there? New Mac, new editing, new day. I realized that when I initially recorded the first part of my gear and aspects, I basically completely covered the screen with my big dumb head. So let me go ahead and move over here. Let's also talk about the fact that I've gone and since made that video, I've drastically increased the quality of my gear, but what I didn't really share were the alternatives or the lower tier gear that you can be wearing in the meantime. So I'm going to try to do this significantly faster, save you some time, and give you better information. So the big things to call out from that video yesterday is that I was using a Shaco and I was using Tyrael's Might. The fun fact about these 2 items is that neither one of them are actually optimal for the endgame build. Air of Perdition is significantly stronger in the endgame, and you're going to see this recommended across the board. The huge amount of critical strike chance, as well as the big damage multiplier here, basically says that you only need one other source of critical strike chance on your gear, and that can come from Grasping Veins. And then if you still need to use Inspiring Leader in your skill tree, if you still need to use the critical strike chance on the Rune Word, you can, but you basically don't need it, and that's why this is going to be recommended across the board. A great alternative is just a helmet that's going to grant you cooldown reduction, maximum life, and then shore up your survivability, either with all resistance, armor, or intelligence for more damage and a little bit of res. Here you can put on more Soul Rift duration. You'll also be able to fit in another aspect. So while here on my build I already have Cursed Aura, I would be able to fit in things like Blood Getters here for another big damage multiplier. Similarly to the Tyrael's, which again is not actually optimal in the endgame build, you're going to be using a legendary armor. So again here, maximum life, armor, Soul Rift duration. You can get damage reduction for your minions to help them stay alive. This would also open up another space for either a defensive or utility aspect. So you could put Hardened Bones here and basically get half of the bonus that Ethereal's Might would be giving you anyways, just in pure damage reduction. Let's just very quickly talk about Ring of Mendeln. This Ring of Mendeln is also significantly stronger than the one that I had in the previous video. The one in the previous video was an Ancestral. It didn't have any greater affixes on it either. Here I got really lucky and I hit greater affix on the actual mastery itself. You obviously want the damage proc of the ring itself to be as high as it possibly can. So here I'm currently missing out on 300 damage from it. 300 damage of that is representative of a very small percentage in damage loss, but in a perfect world, you would want a perfect roll. Currently using a two-handed scythe, you're going to see people using a two-handed sword as well. Basically, the slower base has a higher base damage for the scaling of Mendeln, and then depending on how much attack speed you have on your build, you may be reaching the same breakpoints that you would have been reaching with a two-handed sword. Sadly, we just don't have the data to fully support that because it's really hard to measure minion attack speed breakpoints. There are a ton of great people out in the community who are doing stuff like this, like CTOD and Bacterial, and they have a lot of really good data. But if you're using a two-handed sword, basically slightly faster attacks, slightly lower damage. You want intelligence, maximum life, and then you want crit damage. The temper, the weapon temper itself, the chance to hit twice or the chance to cast twice, does not impact Mendeln at all, but getting Golem hits twice on this build will make it so that the Golem activation has a chance to proc twice as well. Again, won't change Mendeln procs, but will slightly increase your damage output. This is where I'm currently putting Grasping Veins. Now, a perfect roll Grasping Veins says 50% critical strike chance. So as long as you are perpetually casting this, having 50 crit chance just off the rip means that, especially if you're using Air of Perdition, where this one's granting me 38 crit chance, but the base is 20 crit chance, that's already 70% of the total crit that you need. Inspiring Leader from your skill tree gets them another 18%, so now we're talking about 88% crit chance. You can either just use the rune word to grant critical strike chance while standing still, Lithgar, and now you are at 100% crit chance for your minions, and you don't need that stat on any other piece of gear. Not on your rings, not on your amulet, not on your gloves. And then on top of that, Grasping Veins critical strike damage works for Mendeln because it's scaling off of the Necromancer and then reading your minion buffs. So it's a huge 2 times total multiplier. This is now our strongest multiplier by a far margin, and it's comparable to the grandfather, but without 50% crit chance on top of it. For the boots, you want Warrior Mastery. This is one of the few places to get it since we can't fit it onto the helmet with Air of Perdition or with Shaco, whichever one you're using. Movement speed, again, shoring up some of the armor since I'm currently using 2 Uber Uniques that don't grant armor at all. Here's where you put movement speed, more Soul Rift duration, and then typically you can't fit a mobility aspect onto the build. So here's where I'm putting Cursed Aura. Cursed Aura is just insanely good. For the pants, Skeletal Mage Mastery. I did not have 2 Master Aura crits on this in the video that you were seeing, but more Soul Rift duration, damage reduction for your minions, or any other good utility or survivability stat. Here's where I'm putting Occult Dominion for the more maximum skeletons, means more Mendeln procs. For the gloves, Skeletal Mastery, if you need it, attack speed and critical strike chance. If you don't, intelligence, maximum life for any additive damage like crit would be pretty decent here. Putting on at least 1 rank of Corpse Tendril size just somewhere on your build is going to vastly improve your output across the board. And then here's where I'm putting critical strike damage to the second temper, and then reanimation. Now, shouts to Barbarian here because he came up with some pretty cool tech that I never would have thought of because that's just not how my brain works. But basically, reanimation is exactly equivalent to Great Feast. Now, the fun part about Great Feast is that it drains essence from you. And if you put it onto your amulet, it bumps up to 2 essence per minion as opposed to 1 essence. That's got to be worse, right? Well, it turns out if you're using a total of 13 minions, that means that Great Feast will attempt to drain from you whenever you have 26 essence or more. And it turns out that Blight costs 25 essence. So it means that you're able to cast Blight even with Great Feast draining all of your essence whenever you have Soul Rift down. So completely shoutouts to Crypt, never even thought about that. It's just really interesting little minor tech. That's a cool optimization. Talking about the amulet, similar to what I had previously, a passive that increases your damage, critical strike chance, and attack speed if you need it. If you don't, cooldown reduction. This is also a great place to put a total armor roll on the affix, or a total intelligence roll, or a maximum life roll, whichever one either boosts your damage the most or shores up your survivability. Ultimate cooldown reduction is absolutely the goated aspect for both your jewelry slots here. You can do Golem cooldown. I just don't really like it. I feel like the Golem's cooldown is managed completely fine. And basically whenever you don't have Soul Rift up is when you can actually die on the build. Then for your final ring, again, if you need it, critical strike chance and attack speed. If you don't need it, intelligence, maximum life, and then all resistance if you need that to shore up any of your survivability. Or if not, additive crit damage. We're going to do more ultimate cooldown here. We're going to do more crit damage for the temper. Then here's where we have Frenzied Dead. Now, This is going to get way too nitty gritty and nuanced, but let me just throw it out there. If you're currently using Variana and you're already at attack speed cap 1, read the max roll guide on attack speed. It would take me too long to explain it. There's a universe where, depending on your weapon speed, Frenzied Dead is not granting you a huge amount of additional bonus here. You could go with Conceited as a damage multiplier. Outside of that, I just want to talk about a couple alternatives, and especially unique items that you might be finding that you otherwise wouldn't have been using. The first one here is actually Tacets of the Dawning Sky. If you look at Tacets of the Dawning Sky, it's basically Baby's first version of Tyrael's. It gives movement speed, all res, maximum all res, and then stats. Obviously, this one gives damage reduction, so it's a lot stronger. But then on top of that, especially things like Duriel, where Duriel's constantly doing elemental damage in small bursts and then in big bursts, it also grants you maximum resistance to that damage type. So Beast in the Ice, basically any of the bosses that do a primary elemental damage type, Tacets of the Dawning Sky is basically like a cheap version of We Have Tyrael's at Home. Similarly, Yen's Blessing are just like good boots because they have mobility, all stats, maximum evade charges, resource generation, which can be good depending on what build you're playing, and then all resistance as well. On top of that, the casting the skill has a chance to proc a non-mobility, non-ultimate. Your Golem is neither of those. Your Corpse Tendrils is neither of those. So just being able to get a free Corpse Tendrils or a free Golem Smash every couple of seconds went a really long way to be able to help smooth out my transition into the end game. And then let's just talk about Fists of Fate real quick. Fists of Fate are bait. They do work for your minions, they do work for Mendeln, and yes, they're going to make you have the biggest damage explosions possible. Big boy damage. The issue being that if you take the law of averages here and you just look at the expected average increase in your damage, Fists of Fate represent a 50% damage multiplier while losing out on stats that you can get otherwise that would be stronger for the build, most notably Skeletal Mage Mastery on your gloves. And then again, since we're using Air of Perdition in the endgame as well as Grasping Veins, and we have so much attack speed in cap 1, the attack speed and the crit chance on these gloves are effectively dead stats because we don't even want them in the endgame on our build. So what you get is a bunch of Lucky Hit, which is nice for being able to reset the cooldowns on your Soul Rift, which is not bad at all. And then the variance in damage between 1% and 300% on a perfect roll of these gloves. Because keep in mind, if your gloves are worse than perfect, they represent a smaller and smaller expected average damage increase. Like if you only had a 200 roll on these, that means that your expected damage outcome would be 100% base. So it would literally not on average increase your expected damage outcome. Just keep that in mind, right? But sure, I can do triple my damage. So I can go from doing 100 million damage to 300 million damage. Or I could do 1% of my damage, which if you take your 100 million and you chop that down a little bit, drops you down to 1 million damage. And it turns out doing 1 million damage when you can consistently do 100 million damage, it's a really feels bad moment. Don't get baited. Fists of Fate are bad. They might be used for the highest pit tier pushes possible, because it turns out high pit tier pushing ends up coming down to RNG at the end of the day. Just literally everything has to line up. And since Fist of Fate can increase how chaotic your RNG potentials are, it has the highest potential of being able to get a good outcome that was previously unobtainable. I'm not saying they don't have a use. I am saying you're going to get baited by them. The skill tree that you're currently looking at is pretty borked. I don't have my last skill point. I really need to go grab that thing. But you're also going to see very slight differences in the actual planner that I have linked down below. Remember always, the planner is the ideal. What you're currently looking at is what I'm accomplishing with the gear that I have, the stuff that I have, the situation that I find myself in. But it's pretty simple. We want to generate corpses via Lucky Hit. We want Blight to be able to apply a 20% damage bonus. We want to get Necrotic Fortitude, huge amount of barrier. The Titan's Fall will increase our damage, which increases Mendeln's damage. I do have multiple points in Grim Harvest. I just don't need them. I'm just going to move this over here right now. Obviously, all the masteries are maxed. Want as many damage multipliers as we can possibly get. Spiked Armor would help a little bit. You also notice I'm currently running all the way up to Abhorrent Iron Maiden and Abhorrent Decrepify. This is great for resetting all of our cooldowns very quickly. What I like about Abhorrent Iron Maiden and just Iron Maiden in general is that, especially with Great Feast on lower gear, this just proccing automatically from Cursed Aura and generating resource is a nice way of being able to manage that. But on top of that, the Abhorrent Iron Maiden is going to make it so you can actually heal, especially in Helltide, where you have that little like health drain trap event where it's just like it's draining you constantly. This goes a long way for you to be able to actually survive that thing. I basically just have these points here because I like doing Helltide often. More damage reduction in damage, more Lucky Hit chance. If you had the extra points, you put them into Death's Approach, which you could probably take out of the shadow nodes down here. ultimately I want to be using Blood Begets Blood, so I wouldn't be using Corpse Tendrils for vulnerable. I'd actually put it up here for Blood Orbs, because I think that that's where you're going to get the maximum amount of damage possible out of this build, but we'll see how it ends up. Generating a huge amount of Fortify from Necrotic Carapace, and just so that this can annoy you forever, Necrotic Carapace, the idea of having armor on you, is what grants you Fortify. Necrotic Fortitude, the idea of fortifying yourself, is what grants you Barrier, much like a big shell or Carapace. They need to go ahead and swap these two passive names, and now you have to think about that too. Sorry. I currently have skill points down here into the Shadow Passes because they do increase your Shadow Mage's damage, and technically speaking, your Shadow Mage's damage is a non-zero percentage of your total damage output. Is it really important? Probably not. I just need to go ahead and remove these. In fact, I'm just going to show you where they're going to go when you do remove them. So we're going to get ourselves some movement speed here. I'm going to pick up one piece of Thorns because why not? Where else can I drop these in? And you know what? We're going to pick up Finality. We're casting our ult pretty often. Speaking of our ult, Soul Rift for everything that Soul Rift does. Finality now to increase our damage after casting an ult. Obviously Golem Mastery for more damage. Hellbent Commander for more damage. And then Inspiring Leader for more crit chance. We're using Kalan's Edict because we got 13 minions running around. So that's 39 total attack speed and 39 bonus damage. And again, I just want to show off how bad the Paragon board is. You're going to see a very different Paragon board when you look at the planner, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what I've been working with here. So we currently have a rank 1 Eliminator. Shoutouts to this one Eliminator, giving us a 10% damage bonus. Building up into the Cult Leader board, we actually have Dead Razor here. I think this is rank 16 or something like that. Building over into the Golem board, this is where I currently have Corporeal. Corporeal will increase physical damage, which is what Mendeln does, and gives you some movement speed, which is actually pretty nice here. Building up into Flesh Eater, because we're consuming corpses all the time. Here's where I have Essence, huge crit damage multiplier. I think this is my highest rank one. Yeah, and it's only rank 42. So rank 42, rank 17, rank 1, and rank 15. We're getting there, I promise. Finally, I'm building up into Frailty. Frailty is a huge damage multiplier, which I just recently got online. And eventually, I'm going to put a glyph here too, probably Amplify. But yeah, minions are a ton of fun. I really think that having the Golem on the skill bar is the best way to play it, because I really, really do. I hate just running forward and waiting for all of my minions to catch up to me, and instead just sending my Golem Hulk smashing in front of me makes me feel like I'm proactively doing something and able to control the battlefield in a meaningful way, while the rest of my minions come running up to me and stop fighting barrels back 3 screens ago. But this has a massive, massive, massive ceiling left. Easily another like 30 to 40 pit tiers bare minimum, and that's before we start talking about like perfect GG gear. But let me know down in the comments what you think. If you're brand new here, go ahead and subscribe to the channel as well. Leave a like on it if you appreciated this. I hope that you did. We put a ton of time and effort into researching it. Been working with a ton of really smart people in the community. Shout outs to Barbarian, shout outs to my boys Sirach and Sarah and Chronix as well. Thank you all for the insight. I really appreciate y'all. But again, let me know what you think down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video. I truly, truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.